What would you do if the very people you trusted to guide you left you for dead, and the canyon that swallowed you turned out to be hiding the one thing that could set everything right? For Josephine Calder, that question was not a riddle to turn over by the fire. It was the taste of blood and dust in her mouth in the spring of 1886, lying broken at the bottom of a ravine in the Arizona Territory with the sound of her own guide's horse fading into the distance. Jedediah Cross had led her 3 days into Solitude Canyon on the promise of delivering her safely to her late uncle's mining claim, and on the third night he had taken her papers, her money, and her mule, put a bullet crease along her scalp that dropped her like a stone, and ridden away certain the desert would finish what he'd started. All she had left was the torn dress on her back, a father's old brass compass clutched in one fist, and a stubbornness that no amount of blood loss seemed able to touch. She did not know yet that somewhere deeper in that canyon, wedged into the rock for 40 years, sat a dead outlaw's wagon with its gold still inside, and that what she would find there would not only save her own life, but finally settle a debt an entire mining town had been paying without understanding why for 2 generations. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calder. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you had no choice but to trust, tell us in the comments. We would love to hear it tonight. Josephine had grown up in St. Louis in the household of a mining engineer, and though most girls of her class in that city were raised toward pianoforte and needlework, her father, Ezekiel Calder, had never much believed in raising his only daughter toward anything but the same clear-eyed usefulness he valued in himself. Ezekiel spent long stretches of Josephine's childhood away at claims and surveys across the territories, but when he was home he took her walking along the limestone bluffs above the river, teaching her to read the layered stone the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, showing her how a seam of one color beneath another told a story of ancient water and pressure, how the angle of a rock face could tell a trained eye where a vein of or might run true and where it would pinch out to nothing. The ground doesn't lie, Josephine, he told her once, crouched beside her at the edge of a quarry cut, tracing a band of shale with one blunt finger. Men lie constantly. Rock only tells you exactly what happened to it, if you're patient enough to read the whole record instead of just the part that's convenient. She absorbed that lesson so completely that by the time she was 16 she could accompany her father into the field as a genuine assistant rather than a tolerated child, sketching strata, logging assay figures, learning to move through wild country with the same unhurried attentiveness he brought to a rock face, watching for water, for game trails, for the small signs that told a careful traveler where safety lay and where it didn't. There were other lessons, too, that Josephine only came to appreciate fully in hindsight, small habits of mind her father wove so thoroughly into their working partnership that she rarely noticed she was absorbing them at all. He taught her never to trust a single reading of anything, not a rock face, not a man's word, not a company's ledger, without seeking a second, independent confirmation first, a habit born of watching too many eager investors ruin themselves chasing a vein some flattering surveyor had only glanced at once. He taught her, too, to carry always some small, sure thing on her person when working remote country, a compass, a striker, a blade, insisting that a person's judgment failed faster than her tools did when exhaustion or fear set in, and that a steady hand needed something steady to hold. Josephine carried her father's own brass compass from the year she turned 18 onward, not because she especially needed it for direction in the familiar country around St. Louis, but because the weight of it in her pocket had become, over years of fieldwork together, a kind of quiet assurance that she was doing the work properly, the way he had taught her. Her mother had died of a fever when Josephine was 9, and in the years that followed, father and daughter grew unusually close in the particular way of two people who have learned to rely on each other's competence rather than on sentiment alone, though the affection between them ran deep regardless. Ezekiel never remarried, and by the time Josephine was 20 her father had come to treat her less as a daughter to be sheltered and more as a genuine partner in his work, trusting her judgment on matters of terrain and geology that most men of that era would never have thought to ask a woman's opinion on at all. It was through this partnership that Josephine came to know her father's younger brother, Thomas Calder, only through his letters, since Thomas had gone west decades before to try his own fortune in the mining camps of the Arizona Territory and had never once returned east to visit. Thomas's letters, which arrived perhaps twice a year, were full of a rough, hopeful humor that Josephine came to look forward to, tales of failed claims and near misses, and in his last several letters, an increasingly excited certainty that he had finally found a silver vein worth the whole of his life's disappointment, a claim he had named, with his usual dry humor, the second chance. Ezekiel Calder died suddenly of a weak heart in the winter of 1885, and Josephine, left with modest savings and no immediate family beyond her uncle, found herself for the first time in her adult life without the clear, structured purpose her father's work had always given her. It was a letter from Thomas himself, arriving that same winter, that gave her a fresh direction entirely, though not the one either of them could have anticipated. The letter explained, in a hand grown shakier than his usual confident scrawl, that his health had begun failing badly, that he had no wife or children of his own, and that he wished, more than anything, for Josephine to come west and see the second chance claim for herself before he died, since he trusted her father's training in her more than he trusted any lawyer or assay clerk in the territory to understand what he had actually found. Josephine wrote back immediately agreeing to come, and had barely begun making her travel arrangements when a second letter arrived, this one from a stranger, a Faro Springs undertaker, informing her that Thomas Calder had died before her first reply could even reach him, and that his claim, unless a legal heir presented herself within a matter of months, would revert to the territory to be reassigned under mining law. Josephine understood, reading that letter twice by lamplight in her father's empty house, that she had exactly one reason left to travel west at all, and she resolved, with the same unhurried, stubborn clarity her father had always praised in her, to go and claim what her uncle had left her, whatever it turned out to be worth. The journey to Faro Springs took the better part of 3 weeks by rail and stagecoach, and it was only in the town itself, a rough cluster of clapboard buildings pressed against the base of a red-walled canyon country, that Josephine learned how complicated her simple errand had already become. The second chance claim sat some 15 miles beyond the town, accessible only by a rough trail through a stretch of broken country the locals called Solitude Canyon, and the assay office clerk who helped her file her initial claim papers recommended, with what she took at the time for ordinary helpfulness, a guide named Jedediah Cross, a lean, quiet man who had worked the canyon trails for years and knew every dry wash and water hole between Faro Springs and the claim. What Josephine did not know, and would not learn until it was very nearly too late, was that the territory's largest mining concern, the Renshaw Consolidated Company, had been quietly trying to acquire the second chance claim for the better part of a year, certain from their own surveys that Thomas Calder's modest silver strike sat directly above a far richer vein the company's own holdings had failed to reach from any other angle, and that Bartholomew Renshaw, the company's owner, had no intention of allowing a stranger's niece to arrive and formally claim an inheritance that stood squarely in the way of his ambitions. The first 2 days on the trail passed uneventfully enough, Jed Cross proving a capable, if taciturn, guide, and Josephine found herself, despite her grief and her exhaustion, genuinely absorbed by the canyon country unfolding around her, the layered red and ochre walls telling her trained eye a geological story millions of years deep. The first 2 days on the trail passed uneventfully enough, Jed Cross proving a capable, if taciturn, guide, and Josephine found herself, despite her grief and her exhaustion, genuinely absorbed by the canyon country unfolding around her, the layered red and ochre walls telling her trained eye a geological story millions of years deep. She had tried, in those first 2 days, to draw Cross into the kind of easy trail conversation her father had always maintained with his own hired guides over the years, asking after his family, his years working the canyon trails, the small practical wisdom of a man who clearly knew the country intimately, and had found him polite but sparing with his answers, a reticence she had taken at the time for simple frontier reserve rather than the careful discipline of a man already calculating exactly how and where his arrangement with the Renshaw Company would need to be carried out. She noticed, without quite understanding its significance until much later, that Cross seemed unusually attentive to the exact contents of her traveling pack, offering more than once to repack or resecure it against the trail's rougher stretches, and that he steered their route, whenever a fork presented itself, toward the narrower, more isolated side canyons rather than the main trail most freight and mail traffic still used. Explanations she accepted without suspicion because she had no experience yet of a guide's trust being anything other than earned and genuine. It was on the third evening, camped in a narrow side canyon with the fire burned down to embers, that Jed Cross finally spoke more than a handful of words to her at once, asking, in a voice gone suddenly cold and businesslike, for the claim papers and traveling money she carried sewn into the lining of her coat, information he could only have known from someone who had searched her belongings, or been told exactly where to look. When Josephine refused, understanding too late and with a sick lurch what kind of guide she had actually hired, Cross drew his revolver without any particular hurry or apparent regret, and in the scuffle that followed, a bullet grazed hard along her scalp, dropping her senseless to the canyon floor. She would learn much later, from Cross's own eventual confession, that he had been paid a substantial sum by an agent of the Renshaw Company to ensure Thomas Calder's niece never reached Faro Springs to file her claim at all, her death or disappearance in wild country being, from Bartholomew Renshaw's cold calculation, simply the tediest possible outcome. Josephine woke sometime after dawn the following morning, alone, her scalp crusted with dried blood, her mule and supplies gone, her claim papers gone, left with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's old brass compass, which had fallen from her coat pocket during the struggle and lay half buried in the sand beside her. What would you do, finding yourself broken and abandoned in country that offered no mercy to the lost, with every reasonable calculation suggesting you would not survive to see another sunset? Josephine did the only thing her father's training had ever truly prepared her for, she read the ground. She traced the faint downward slope of the wash toward what her geological instinct told her must eventually lead to water, and began, unsteadily and in terrible pain, to walk. She spent 2 days moving through that broken country in a state she would later remember only in fragmented, fever-bright pieces. The cool relief of a hidden seep spring her father's training helped her spot by the telltale green of desert willow against red rock, a night spent shivering in the lee of a boulder with no fire, the growing, dangerous conviction that she had wandered in a circle and would simply keep wandering until her legs gave out entirely. It was on the second afternoon, following the only line of shade available along a narrow, rubble-choked side canyon, that she came upon something that struck her feverish mind at first as an impossible hallucination. Wedged deep in a cleft where the canyon walls pinched nearly together, half buried under decades of rockfall and drifted sand, sat the ruined remains of a heavy freight wagon, its wooden sides bleached silver-gray by sun and weather, one shattered wheel still hanging from its axle. At a broken angle. It looked, in the failing afternoon light, like something the canyon itself had swallowed and half-digested, a relic from some flood or rockslide long before her own lifetime, and though every rational instinct told her that a wrecked wagon offered no more help to a starving, wounded woman than the bare rock around it, something in its stubborn, half-buried persistence held her feverish attention the way little else had in 2 days of wandering. She circled the wreck slowly, using her father's compass less for direction now than for the small, steadying comfort of its familiar weight in her palm, and it was in that slow circling that she noticed the wagon's bed had been fitted, at some point in its ruin, with a second floor built just above the true one, a shallow false compartment that would have been entirely invisible to a casual glance but that her father's training in reading disturbed and deliberately altered ground made almost impossible for her to miss once she'd noticed the seam. Working with a flat stone and what remained of her strength, she pried at the edge of that false floor until the rotted wood finally gave way, and beneath it, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and had long since gone to brittle scraps, she found a small iron strongbox, still closed, and beside it, a leather satchel containing a water-damaged journal whose first page bore a name written in a hand grown increasingly unsteady toward the end of its entries, Amos Whitlock. Josephine understood almost nothing of what she had found in that first exhausted moment beyond the simple, staggering fact that the strongbox, when she finally forced its corroded latch, held gold, coin and small ingots both, tarnished nearly black but unmistakably real, more wealth than she had ever seen gathered in one place in her life. What would you guess a dead man's wagon could possibly be hiding, buried in a false floor for what her father's trained eye told her, from the wagon's construction and the sediment built up around it, must have been the better part of 40 years. Whatever you're imagining, we promise the truth waiting in that journal was stranger still. She was too weak that evening to do more than gather the journal and a few coins into what remained of her torn petticoat, but she slept that night, for the first time since Jed Cross had left her for dead, with something other than despair keeping her company. It was Zebediah Post, an old prospector working a modest claim some 6 miles further into the canyon country, who found Josephine the following morning, collapsed but alive at the mouth of the side canyon, the journal still clutched against her chest. Jedediah had lived in that country for the better part of 30 years, weathered and solitary but not unkind, and he carried her back to his own small camp, tended her wound with the rough competence of a man who had patched up plenty of his own injuries over the decades, and listened, once she had recovered enough strength to speak clearly, to the whole strange account of Jed Cross's betrayal and the wrecked wagon in the side canyon. When she showed him the journal and a handful of the gold coins, Jedediah went very quiet for a long moment, turning one blackened coin over in his weathered fingers, before telling her that he had heard the old story of Amos Whitlock more times than he could count around more campfires than he could remember, though he had always taken it for the kind of half-true legend every mining district accumulates about its lost outlaws and vanished fortunes. The journal, once Josephine had recovered enough over the following days to read it properly by Jedediah's fire, told a story considerably stranger and sadder than any campfire legend. Amos Whitlock had come to the Faro Springs district in the 1840s as a teamster hauling ore and payroll for the district's earliest mining concern, a modest operation that would, decades later, grow into the Renshaw Consolidated Company, and his journal, written in increasingly desperate entries across what appeared to be the final weeks of his life, described in careful detail how the company's paymaster at the time, a hard, ambitious man named Cyrus Renshaw, had orchestrated the theft of an entire season's mining payroll during a supply run through Solitude Canyon, staging the robbery to look like the work of highway bandits, and had then quietly ensured that suspicion fell entirely upon Whitlock himself, the teamster who had been driving the payroll wagon and who had, in Cyrus Renshaw's careful arrangement, no one to vouch for his whereabouts during the crucial hours in question. Whitlock wrote that he had fled into the canyon country not because he was guilty, but because he understood, watching Renshaw's careful campaign of suspicion take hold among the miners and company men, that he would never receive anything resembling a fair hearing, and that his only hope of eventually clearing his name lay in somehow proving what Renshaw had actually done. He had managed, in the chaos of the robbery itself, to recover a portion of the stolen payroll from where Renshaw's hired men had cached it, intending to use it as evidence rather than plunder, but a posse organized by Renshaw himself had run him to ground in the canyon before he could make his way to anyone who might listen, and in the desperate flight that followed, his wagon had gone over a washed-out section of trail during a sudden storm, pinning him, badly injured, in the wreckage long enough to write his account before the desert finished what the fall had started. Josephine sat with that journal for a long while after finishing its final entry, understanding, with the same steadying clarity her father had always praised in her, exactly what she now held. Amos Whitlock had not been a thief at all, but a man framed by an ambitious paymaster whose family, for decades later, still controlled the largest mining interest in the entire district, a man whose own great-grandson, Bartholomew Renshaw, had very nearly succeeded in having Josephine herself murdered in almost exactly the same stretch of canyon country, for almost exactly the same reason. To remove an inconvenient claimant standing between a Renshaw and a fortune he believed rightfully his. The gold in Whitlock's strongbox was not simply treasure. It was the recovered remnant of an entire mining season's wages, stolen from the pockets of working men whose descendants, Josephine suspected, likely still lived and labored in Faro Springs without ever knowing the true story of why that long-ago season's pay had come up so mysteriously short. The gold in Whitlock's strongbox was not simply treasure. It was the recovered remnant of an entire mining season's wages, stolen from the pockets of working men whose descendants, Josephine suspected, likely still lived and labored in Faro Springs without ever knowing the true story of why that long-ago season's pay had come up so mysteriously short. She found herself, in the days that followed, thinking often of Amos Whitlock in much the way she had once thought of her own father across the long silences of a field survey, as though the dead teamster had become, through the accident of her discovery, a kind of second and unexpected teacher. She pictured him in his final days, trapped and bleeding in the wreckage of his own wagon, choosing to spend what little strength remained to him not on prayers or regrets but on the patient, careful work of setting down a true record for whoever might eventually find it, the same instinct her father had spent a lifetime trying to instill in her own hands and eyes. She wondered whether he had known, writing those final desperate pages, that no one might ever read them at all, that the canyon might simply keep his account exactly as thoroughly as it had kept his bones, and she found that possibility, more than any other detail of his story, settled into her chest with a grief that surprised her for a man she had never met and who had died decades before her own birth. She understood, turning the journal's brittle pages by Jedediah's fire, that she had not merely stumbled upon a fortune in old gold. She had been handed the last, most stubborn act of a man who had refused, even facing certain death alone in the rock, to let a lie simply stand unanswered. She understood, too, how little a 40-year-old journal and a strongbox of unmarked gold would matter to anyone in Faro Springs set against 3 generations of Renshaw wealth and standing, particularly when the man most likely to sit in judgment over any dispute involving the second chance claim was a territorial land office thoroughly accustomed to deferring to Bartholomew Renshaw's interests. If she was right about what Whitlock's account meant, she was holding evidence that could unravel the entire foundation of the Renshaw family's fortune, and she had survived a murder attempt only to find herself, once again, a woman with almost no standing trying to bring down the most powerful family in the territory. Jedediah Post, once he had absorbed the full weight of what Josephine had found, proved an unexpectedly steady ally, his decades in the canyon country having left him with a long memory for old grievances and very little patience left for company men who had spent those same decades growing rich off other people's labor. He knew, better than Josephine could have learned in months of asking, which of Faro Springs' older families had lost fathers or husbands to that long-ago payroll shortfall, families who had simply been told the season's pay had run short due to poor yields, and had had no reason then or since to imagine anything more sinister than an ordinary bad year. Together, over the following weeks, moving carefully and telling only Jedediah's most trusted old friends what they had actually found, Josephine and her unlikely protector began quietly gathering the pieces that would let a 60-year-old wrong finally be laid before the one authority even Bartholomew Renshaw could not simply purchase or intimidate into silence, the territorial marshal's office in the county seat, which retained jurisdiction over any matter involving attempted murder on a federal mining claim, whatever else local land disputes might otherwise be quietly settled between powerful men. It was Jed Cross himself, unexpectedly, who broke the case open fully. Word had reached him, through the same rough channels that carried most news through that country, that the woman he had left for dead in Solitude Canyon had somehow survived, and Cross, who Josephine came to understand was a weak and frightened man rather than a truly hardened one, arrived at Jedediah's camp late one evening in a state of considerable agitation, uncertain whether he had come to silence her permanently or to beg her forgiveness, and finding himself, once actually confronted with her steady, unflinching gaze across Jedediah's fire, entirely unable to manage the former. He confessed everything, Renshaw's payment, the instructions to ensure her disappearance, his own cowardice in carrying it out only halfway and then fleeing rather than confirming her death, and agreed, in exchange for whatever leniency the marshal might extend him, to testify to the whole arrangement. Bartholomew Renshaw, informed too late that his hired guide had turned, attempted to have both Cross and Josephine quietly dealt with by other means, an effort that only further implicated him once one of his own hired men, uneasy at being asked to commit outright murder against a woman under federal claim protection, brought word of the plot directly to the marshal's deputy stationed in Faro Springs. Bartholomew Renshaw, informed too late that his hired guide had turned, attempted to have both Cross and Josephine quietly dealt with by other means, an effort that only further implicated him once one of his own hired men, uneasy at being asked to commit outright murder against a woman under federal claim protection, brought word of the plot directly to the marshal's deputy stationed in Faro Springs. Those final tense weeks before the hearing tested Josephine's nerve more thoroughly than the canyon itself had, since a wound and a hostile landscape, she came to feel, were at least honest in their danger, while a powerful man's polite, unhurried threats carried a different and more corrosive kind of fear. Jedediah insisted she stay close to his own camp rather than risk the isolated claim office alone, and took to keeping his old rifle within easy reach at all hours, a precaution Josephine privately thought excessive until the night two riders she did not recognize passed slowly along the ridge above the camp without stopping, their purpose never explained but their message, she felt certain, entirely clear. She found herself, in those anxious nights, returning again to her father's old habit of seeking a second confirmation before trusting any single account, and made certain, working with Jedediah's help, that copies of Whitlock's journal existed in more than one hand and more than one location before she ever agreed to appear publicly at the county seat. The reckoning, when it finally came that autumn, unfolded across a territorial hearing that drew nearly the whole of Faro Springs to the county seat, Josephine testifying with Whitlock's journal and the recovered gold laid before the marshal as evidence both of Cross's confessed attack and of the Renshaw family's older, deeper crime. Bartholomew Renshaw argued, predictably, that whatever his own great-grandfather might have done decades before bore no legal weight against him, and that Cross had acted entirely on his own initiative in attacking Josephine, a claim that collapsed entirely once the marshal produced Cross's full-signed confession along with corroborating testimony from Renshaw's own uneasy hired man. Bartholomew was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder against Josephine, a charge that carried real weight even in a territory generally forgiving of powerful men's excesses, and though the older matter of Cyrus Renshaw's payroll theft lay far too deep in the past for any criminal charge to reach it, the marshal's public reading of Whitlock's full journal into the hearing record accomplished something Josephine had not fully anticipated. It broke, in a single afternoon, the unquestioned deference Faro Springs had shown the Renshaw name for 3 generations, as families who had spent decades accepting a long-ago bad season without question finally understood exactly what had actually happened to their grandfather's missing wages. Josephine used the recovered gold exactly as Amos Whitlock's own desperate final entries had hoped someone eventually might, working with the marshal's office to identify and compensate, as best the passage of decades allowed, the surviving descendants of the mining families whose wages had been stolen that long-ago season, keeping for herself only enough, once her uncle's second chance claim was formally and finally confirmed in her name, to properly develop the modest but genuine silver vein Thomas Calder had spent his final years so proud of finding. Bartholomew Renshaw's conviction cost his company both its owner and a considerable portion of its standing, and though the Renshaw Consolidated Company itself survived under new management, it did so only after its board publicly and formally cleared Amos Whitlock's name, a small, decades overdue act of justice that Josephine made a condition of any further peace between her claim and the company's continued operations in the district. She built her own small operation at the second chance claim not merely as a mine, but as something closer to what her father's whole quiet philosophy had always insisted upon, an enterprise run on the plain principle that the ground, properly and honestly read, told the truth even when the men standing on it preferred otherwise. She kept Amos Whitlock's journal, carefully preserved, in a small glass case at her claim office alongside her father's old brass compass, not as a trophy but as a reminder of what patient, careful attention could still uncover, 40 years after everyone else had stopped looking. She thought often, walking the canyon trails that had so nearly killed her, of her father's voice teaching her to read a rock face, and of Amos Whitlock's increasingly desperate hand in that water-stained journal, and understood that both men had tried, each in his own way, to teach her the same single lesson, that the ground, and the people the world had left for dead upon it, very often kept a far more honest record than the powerful men who assumed no one would ever trouble to read it. Josephine Calder, who had once lain broken and abandoned at the bottom of a canyon wash with nothing left but a compass and her own stubborn will to survive, became within 2 years one of the most respected mine owners in the Faro Springs district, not because fortune had suddenly favored her, but because she had refused to let a bullet, a betrayal, or a canyon's vast indifference keep her from reading, patiently and to the very end, a story everyone else had assumed was finished. She never fully trusted a hired guide again without her own careful judgment to accompany his, though she found, in the years that followed, a small and steady circle of genuine friendship in Faro Springs that had not existed for her when she first arrived a grieving, unknown stranger. Jedediah took to telling any traveler who passed through his claim the story of the woman he'd found half dead in the wash and the outlaw's wagon that had saved her, adding some fresh flourish to the tale each season, though its heart never changed in the telling. And on quiet evenings, once the day's essay work was finished, Josephine would sometimes take down Whitlock's old journal and read again its final entry, written by a dying man who had never stopped believing that the truth, however long buried, eventually find someone patient enough to dig it out, and feel, every time, the particular, settled satisfaction of a debt 40 years overdue finally, honestly paid. She would think, on those evenings, of her father's voice at the quarry's edge and Whitlock's failing hand in that canyon wreckage, 2 men separated by decades and circumstance who had each tried, in their own way, to teach her that the ground remembers what men would rather forget. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Josephine's story tonight, and for staying with her through both the canyon's cruelty and the long-buried, patient justice it finally gave up. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs the reminder that even the ground the world has left for dead can still hold the truth, if someone is patient enough to read it. And we would love to know, what is a time you found value in something everyone else had already written off, or found strength in yourself that you didn't know you still had? Tell us in the comments below, we read every single one. Until next time, stay close.